born into an extremely wealthy, family, New York City kind of WASP type environment and background. My father was usually always traveling and fairly absent. My mother was an alcoholic who drank herself to death. She had 7 sons, so it was obviously not easy for her. I don't honestly remember that much of my early childhood, and I was sent off to boarding school at the age of 12 years old. And basically, when I came home for the first vacation at the age of 12, my mother had decided to divorce my father. He had decided to get remarried, and I no longer even had a bedroom in the house. My clothes and stuff were packed up and put in the basement, and I was told to share a room with 3 of my other brothers, etc. So really, from that point on, at 12, I didn't feel that I really had any kind of home. My heavy drug and alcohol use started, not coincidentally, right about that time. And I'm a complete raging alcoholic and addict. And I went to a really, really good, rather well-known prep school, which I managed to graduate from with pretty good grades. And then I went to a equally well-known university, and I got into what my mother would later refer to as a spot of bother. And I was indicted by a federal grand jury for trafficking in heroin and a bunch of other stuff. A lot of people would tell you that was the end of their story. The depth of my insanity was that was really the beginning of my story. And then I had lots of other misadventures. Following that, I took up my first career, which was as a journalist, somewhat by accident, and I worked as a journalist covering sub-Saharan Africa for about 14 years, based out of London. I got into all sorts of things there, very few good, some okay, and some absolutely horrendous. When I was sober enough, I was a very good journalist and had quite a few accomplishments, but the period of that lasted relatively short amount of time, and sooner or later my drinking and drugging really took over. And so basically the summation of my active drinking and drugging career, and I say this in meetings because I don't like long drunkalogues, is that there's no level of physical, spiritual, or moral depravity that my disease did not take me to, full stop. I first went into treatment at the age of 30, about 35 years ago, and I got abstinent from alcohol, but this was the era before the disease concept and the whole concept of cross addiction had really taken root. And when I left the rehab, I told them that obviously I was not going to drink again because I got it about the drinking, but that I probably was going to smoke the occasional joint. And in those days, they did say, well, we're not sure that's really a good idea, but they did not kind of in any way, discourage me from it. As long as I said I'm going to my AA meetings and I'm going to work the steps. Of course, I didn't go to AA meetings. I stopped working the steps, and I smoked marijuana, and I did stay abstinent from alcohol for 4 years, and then I relapsed. So that time when I went through treatment, which was 30 years ago, by the grace of God, I got it completely and I got sober. About a year after that, in the typical cliche fashion, I decided that I really wanted to give something back to the field. And so I started looking around, and I came in contact with the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, better known as the NCADD. And anyone in the field watching knows who they are. They're the oldest advocacy organization organization in the U.S., and I spent a long time on their board. But one of the offshoots of that was, in return for a donation, I was allowed to create any kind of project that I wanted to create. And the part I left out of the story, which is relevant here, is that my family and I, and we're a true disease model. My mother, as noted, drank herself to death. My father was an alcoholic who eventually got sober. 4 out of my 6 brothers are alcoholics and addicts. Because of that, we ended up buying the treatment center that we had all gone to. So that was kind of my introduction to the business, quote unquote, of recovery. I had one brother who I would say was an abuser and self-moderated, and he's okay. The other brother, I would say, is most definitely alcoholic, but he substituted Buddhism because he realized early on that he had real issues around alcohol, and he was able to substitute Buddhism, the practice, very active practice of Buddhism, for alcoholism. However, he had definite personality issues that were very related to alcoholism that did create a lot of difficulties in his life. And I'm not going to go into detail because that's his business, and my half-brother was also alcoholic. And the reality is that alcohol killed 2 out of my 4 grandparents, my mother, my uncle, and it's very close to killing one of my brothers who never got into recovery. In my case, and it's interesting, is I used to have fairly simplistic views, which dovetailed, I think, with the science at the time that it was really genetics. In our case, I really do think it was genetics. Clearly, there was an environment in the family, etc., that did nothing to stop the genetics, but we're really not one of those cases, which I've learned more and more about, that kind of make that connection, shall we say, less than mandatory. I think, personally, I think it's rare but possible that people get addicted if they're not genetically loaded. But I also think that there are a lot of people that end up getting addicted more because of environmental issues than the genetic predisposition. In other words, if they may have been genetically loaded, but if they hadn't been involved in a very specific environment, set of events, trauma, family dysfunctionality, whatever we might call it, it's unlikely that they would have triggered. But that's a personal, unscientific view. Clearly, in the case of my family, though, it's very difficult to argue that genetics were not compelling. And one of my brothers actually did a full-scale therapeutic family reconstruction, and we researched our family's addictive history back 12 generations. And there was alcoholism in every single generation but one. And in that generation, they had all become religious bigots, which was probably a manifestation of the kind of alcoholic, addictive, obsessive, trait that just came out in a different way with that generation. So we're a pretty compelling model for the family genetic, disease concept. Buying the treatment program for the first time really got me kind of involved with the dynamics of treatment, a real treatment for other folks, etc. It was a interesting learning curve. The facility we bought, all false modesty aside, was a really, really top drawer facility. Very small, had really good outcome, and yes, we did collect outcome. A very high reputation in the field, and some really outstanding folks working for it. But a couple of interesting things about getting into the business for a recovering person. One thing for me was that the real danger, which I almost succumbed to in that process, was that as I got more involved in the business, and while I was not involved in day-to-day management, I certainly was talking to the management on a weekly basis, processing a lot of the larger issues around the operation with them, etc. So I was about as involved as you could be without being a frontline manager in the operation of the business. Obviously not in clinical issues with confidentiality, etc., but within the constraints of that. Gradually that involvement started to replace my actual recovery. And that whole kind of idea of I don't really need to go to 5 AA meetings a week because I'm on the phone with the folks at the Friary for 2 hours a day, and that really is just the same or even better as an AA meeting. And luckily for me, I had a good sponsor and the folks at the Friary who kind of identified that happening and really snapped me back to earth and said, there's the Friary and there's recovery, and they have nothing to do with each other. My personal experience in this field is I've seen a number of people, some of whom I've been very close to, fall prey to that trap. And the distressing thing for me, and this is a personal observation, is that amongst the younger generation, it's my perception that there are a great many of them that are at this point tiptoeing a very fine line between my job as my recovery and relapse. And it is an issue that is of some concern to me. I think that the field has huge workforce issues, which we can maybe get to later, because we have some real problems in this field. So the Friary is germane because when we bought it, it was about 5 years before the managed cost correction that started kind of in the mid to late 80s. We weren't stupid, and we saw it coming along, and so we looked at other ways we could develop other business models off of the rehab piece that potentially might float in a really changed environment. And I have to say that we basically, without calling it that, created the first psychiatric managed care model that I've ever heard of. And in 1988, we approached a very, very wealthy Canadian family who were buying Aetna with cash, and through a quirk of fate, we were able to pitch them, and they agreed to set us up in a psychiatric managed care business. And basically our concept, we called it Project Match, was we were going to train their HR departments to purchase and monitor their own services, not to provide them themselves, but to be able to have the skill and expertise to understand what they were purchasing, measure whether it was getting them what they wanted, and act accordingly, which now seems like, almost infantile. But believe me, in the late 1980s, no one was talking in those terms. And we basically had the whole deal, contract stage, everything else. I can tell you exactly when it was. I remember now. It was 1987. And about 3 months before the big crash, the Canadian family, who were really smart, and we had reached the point of getting ready to sign the contract and close the deal, asked us to fly up to Montreal and apologetically said, folks, we don't like what we're seeing in the American market, and we're pulling out and redeploying to Europe. And the deal cratered. So that all kind of went away. We were lucky a couple of years later. Baptist Hospital Group, who are a huge for-profit, not-for-profit in the field, had always wanted the Friary, coveted us because of our reputation, and we were able to sell to them at a very high price even after the managed cost correction had started, and that was an HP thing. And also, I think an argument for excellence, as I say, is always the best revenge. And so we were both lucky, but we were good enough to get lucky. So in any event, that kind of disassociated me from treatment for 3 to 4 years. And about the fourth year after the Friary was sold was about the fourth year in my recovery. And I'd kind of at that point been involved with the NCADD, but didn't really have any traction. I wasn't really that involved, etc. And I had some family money to give away, and I said to them, I will give the money away if I can do my own project, thinking they would say, well, you don't want your money unless it's no strings attached. And much to my horror and chagrin, they accepted the money right away and said, what's your project? And at that point, I was in real trouble. So I left the room and I called the person at the Friary who had developed Project Match with us and said, what about Project Match? Is this something we can do elsewhere or something driven off of it? And so basically COBB was born out of that. We called the head of the NCADD at that point, Paul Wood, wrote a letter out to 12 of the most significant people in the addiction treatment field, and he had to write the letter because certainly no one knew who I was, and invited them to a crisis meeting to discuss the financial, environment that was being created as we spoke and look at possible options we had to really deal with the huge shrinkage of funding that took place with the managed cost correction. And so all of these people agreed to show up. Again, even more horror on my part, but I pulled together some experts that people I knew, and we started the first of a long series of policy meetings that were really quite unique. They were unique in the fact that because the National Council was perceived as an honest broker, we were able to invite people to the table that were not talking to each other. So we were able to get insurance people, the payers, the administrators, the clinicians, etc., and get them to sit in a room and say, okay, folks, we all know what's happening now isn't working. In a perfect world, what kind of system would we design that would make sense? More importantly, the basic philosophical foundation of COBB was a keep it simple, stupid proposition, which was the only way you were going to get payers to go back in their pockets and start taking their money out again was to convince them that there was some value to what they were purchasing. And the field was in no place to do that. So COBB started a long process, multi-pronged, to deal with all of the issues involved with recreating a value proposition, giving some, kind of financial and clinical and statistical analysis to decision makers that was meaningful to them, all of those things. And of course, like so many things, what looks simple when you begin leads to this branch, to this branch, to this piece of work. We did a lot of work. I would say, again, without too much false modesty, that in our first 5 to 8 years, we had a significant impact on policy, the general dialogue, the terminology of the debate. I don't attribute that, certainly in no way, to myself. I attribute it to two things. One, there was a huge need in the field and a perceived need. And two, we had, through no fault of my own, most of the top folks in the field participating in our process. And 30 years ago, it was an environment where folks in the field, it was a much smaller field, folks in the field then not only were encouraged by their employers to participate, they were supported financially by their employer. And in reality, COBB would not be in existence except for the fact that in the second year we were really starting as a committee of the NCADD, and we were beginning to get traction. There's no question of that. But we also had very little money because though I had access to the kind of the family foundation, etc., I was my parents were still alive, and they were giving most of the money out to their interest, which was fine, but I didn't have much money to contribute, and we really did not have enough money to keep going. And so I went out and tried to do some fundraising, which I'm not very good at. But I sat down and talked to Adele. And I had 2 or 3 of the big people in the field come in and talk to her, who I knew she respected, and they told her they thought this really had a chance. And she turned around and wrote us a $100,000 check, which back then was a lot of money. And so I would be very remiss in saying that we would not be here without Adele Smithers. They hadn't kind of taken me under their wing, opened their Rolodexes up for me, opened all sorts of doors. COBB nor myself would not be where we are. An organization like COBB, if it were tried to be started and implemented today, would have very little chance of success because the environment has changed hugely. I also believe the nature of the practitioners and the folks involved in the environment have changed. And no offense to the younger folks coming in, the old farts, as I like to refer to ourselves, were mission driven, but our primary mission was helping folks out there that were suffering. Most of the younger generation are also mission driven, but their primary mission right now is furthering their own careers. And I know that's not, certainly it's not a true statement blanket wise, but it's absolutely true with a far larger majority of the folks we deal with now than we dealt with 30 years ago. And that is a value judgment, but it's also the truth, and one of our great problems in the field today. Lots and nothing, and so where to start? On a macro level, the things that haven't changed, and I think this is a real indictment of all of us, and I put myself right up there at the top of the list with everyone else. Shame and stigma are actually worse now than they were 30 years ago. The amount of discrimination that's out there on a functional level against recovering folks, whether it be life insurance pricing, the amount of time and what we need to do to get licensure back. I could go down access to treatment services. I could go down a long list. None of that's improved. In fact, one could argue that some of it might even be worse. Maybe not with respect to treatment type services, but certainly with respect to some of the very real areas in real life, insurance pricing, things of that nature. I would argue things have probably gotten substantially worse. The third part that I think is really the most, I was going to say unforgivable, but maybe unfortunate is a better word, is that real outcome, 5 years or more of abstinence or whatever we're going to call it, is basically the same today as it was 30 years ago when I started. And I think that's a pretty stunning indictment of everyone involved in this process. And as I said, I don't leave ourselves out of this, but let's not leave out the policymakers, the clinicians, the payers. It's a very long list, and we've all participated in one of the least productive social engineering fiascos in history, in modern history. If we think about the amount of money spent and the significant results thereby obtained, it's not a pretty picture. On the good side, I think there have been advances in service delivery. I think there have been advances from a point of view of support mechanisms and industry groups. ASAM has certainly been mentioned by many. There's certainly been research that potentially could be very helpful. The real problem I see is that the far fewer positive things that have happened have not been effectively leveraged. And I attribute that to the fact that the stigma is still so compelling that it's very difficult to harvest what value there is in the few good things that have come along. Okay, well, and when we talk about leap forwards, we have to differentiate between conceptual leaps and leaps that actually took place. And I say this with very relevant history to COBB. And I'll give you a for instance. 30 years ago, when COBB started, no one was talking about the concept of outcomes-based service delivery, using clinical outcome to improve the delivery of service. After 5 to 8 years, in no small part due to COBB, everyone was talking about it. After 30 years, again, in no small part due to our failures, no one is still no one is doing it. That's one example. Another example would be that we all understand now that basically the distribution of services with respect to the chronicity of the condition we're talking about is totally wrong. We've known for 30 years that we shouldn't be placing 90% of our chips in the first, intensive encounter of dealing with a condition, and that we should be looking at a much, much longer spectrum of treatment with using a lot of non-medical type services. We've known this. We've known this for well over 25 years. Again, absolutely no traction on the ground. And all of this stuff goes back to the fact that it's stigma and ignorance and stigma. And basically we haven't been able to break those down. And so we've allowed ourselves to become taken over by the payers, the insurance payment model, who dictate what services they will pay for. And like the good little doggies we are, we jump up and do what we do for the bones. One of my gripes is that not enough of us have stood up to the payers and said, you're flat out wrong. And really taken a stand. I think that treatment has become a huge, huge business. And yes, that may be inevitable, but I don't believe it's inevitable that it has to have become as unhealthy as it is. And we're looking at an industry that has as dubious a set of ethical practices in a lot of levels as almost any other industry I can think of, and yet we're supposed to be of a much higher ethical standard because we're dealing with people's lives. And yes, I know it's human nature, but there's something particularly repellent to me about the behaviors I see going on out there in the field. And it's hard for me to believe that if this wasn't a, whatever billion-dollar industry number you want to pick, that a lot of this would be happening. Well, one advance I did leave out, though. It is true, and we're talking about medically assisted treat. There have been some actually useful drugs developed. Also, I believe, and I'm not a top researcher here, but folks I really trust tell me that we are on the cusp of some discoveries with relation to brain science that are going to greatly improve, the efficacy of treatment. But I would hasten to add, everyone is looking for a silver bullet, a pill that's going to fix everything. I don't believe in that. I don't believe there'll ever be a pill. I believe we're dealing with behavioral patterns driven by underlying traumas that aren't going to get fixed with pills. I think, however, the folks I talk to that I trust tell me that they believe that the brain research is going to give us more pathways to get folks into a positive recovery track or a positive wellness track, if you will, than we have now. We're going to learn to tailor specific approaches to people with specific addictions in different ways. We'll still be aiming to get them to the same goal, but we're going to find different entrance routes that are going to work better with different types of addiction. That's something that does excite me, because I think that really could have an impact. The current scandal right now about all the drug testing is certainly an absolute example. Bounties for patient referrals. We could go down. We could go down a list of just tons of things that are happening right, left, and center, and everyone whispers about them, but no one is really doing anything or taking any kind of leadership role to deal with them. And the problem is, we are always going to be held to a higher standard, again, because of shame and stigma. And so it's all the more repellent to me that a lot of the folks who are perpetrating these deeds claim they're in recovery, and yet they're eating their young, so to speak, with what they're doing to the clients. And the level of hypocrisy, you know, in this field is staggering. It almost makes me yearn for Wall Street, where they're very upfront about their total lack of ethics. You know, I'm in this for the money. This is it. We're making this decision based on this, and that. If you don't like it, tough. That would at least be more honest than our behavior. Another example, I believe that one of the greatest, what will come to be seen as one of the greatest epidemics of medical malpractice in history, is the current binge on oversubscription of psychotropic substances. And I'm not talking opiate substitutes here. I believe in 30 to 40 years, when they take a toll of the damage of this, it will be seen as one of the great periods of ignorance-driven, you know, medical malpractice in history. Our field refuses on any level to get involved in examining this issue, and worse than that, are all too willing accomplices that are participating fully in this. Again, blanket statement is not meant to cover 100% of the field in any way, but substantial portions of our field are aiding and abetting this and doing nothing at all to stop it. Our workforce related issues are huge. We have a staff that, for sometimes good reasons and good value, have a high percentage of recovering folks in it. But that's a two-edged sword, because a great many of those folks have significant unresolved issues of their own that greatly impair their ability to provide quality services. Our field's not interested. That's a topic no one wants to remotely. That's a topic that's even scarier than psychotropic drugs. Or, you know, many of the other things we're talking about. So we have a field that seems to be totally incapable of self-analysis and any kind of, you know, ethical inventory. And I think that's really doesn't say a lot for us. And again, I don't know whether that's a knock-on compounded effect of stigma, where we don't think we're worth it. And I think that is probably a big driver of this. And so you keep hearing me say shame and stigma, but shame and stigma are the coda. And they are still the coda that frames our existence and drives everything negative. And there's a lot of negative that's going on in this field. I'd like to see the field 10 years from now, and this is something I know will not happen. I'd like to see the field 10 years from now go back to the pre-treatment as a business era of the late 70s and early 80s, when we had Hazel's Den, we had recovery houses, we had non-medical service delivery, and I hate the term treatment. Language is a huge baggage for this field. I'd like to see us go back to that, because basically, as I was taught by a certain Dr. William Ford, one of our big problems is that the bulk of services that are effective for our condition, or whatever we're calling it, are not medical. And yet we made the huge mistake of classifying ourselves as a medical condition for very good reasons, but the law of unintended consequences has come back catastrophically in this case. So I'd like to see us get back to the era of non-medicalized, except when medical intervention is required, and there are times it's appropriate and required. But I'd like to see us largely go back to that era, and I'd like to see it cease to become a business. And I don't think either of those are possible. But I do think that what may occur if we get into a really difficult financial environment is we may see a lot of non-medical, appropriately priced service delivery coming back. And that I would hope for. My words of wisdom to 20-somethings in the field would be, don't not accept anything without hearing it and looking thoroughly at it. My attitudes have changed so drastically from where they were 30 years ago. When I started COBB, I thought everyone needed to go to the Friary for 28 days. And if we just figured out how to pay for the Friary for everyone who needed it, life would be hunky-dory and they'd all get well like I did. Well, much as I love the Friary, it had about 10% to do with my recovery. But of course, I didn't know that at the time. And by the way, there were very few people who did that 10% as well as they did. So that's not a knock, but all they did was get me to a readiness stage in real terms to get into recovery. So I would tell them not to try to have an open mind. I would tell them that there are things I believe now that if you'd asked me 30 years ago, I would have told you there's no way I'll ever believe or accept that. I would also tell them that they need to, try if they can to really do good, not just do well. And I don't believe that you can do well and good at the same time, as the old cliche goes. So my advice to them would be do well in your career and then figure out separately how you can do some good. But if you try to put the two together, it's going to be a very difficult exercise. And the last thing I would say, and this is a saying, it's not mine, that I really appreciate more and more at my age, is that a man who plants trees under whose shade he will never sit really gets the meaning of life. And I think that the biggest, most valuable activities in my life have been the giving it away ones. And when we get to our age, you begin to realize that all the other stuff is just gas.